Welcome back to Bookkast, Bestsellers in Minutes. So many books, so little time.
Yeah.
Today, we are going to be tackling On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder.
Okay.
Now, this book is super relevant, even though it focuses on 20th century lessons for resisting tyranny. It's like a guidebook, right?
Yeah.
For spotting the warning signs and understanding how these seemingly small things can just snowball into huge problems.
Right. And what makes On Tyranny so powerful is how Snyder connects these historical events to what's happening in the world today.
Right.
He's not just saying, hey, remember that bad thing that happened way back when?
Yeah.
He's drawing parallels to current events and showing us how easily we can fall into the same traps, if we're not careful.
Okay, so let's dive into the first lesson.
Okay.
Do not obey in advance. I was floored by this one.
Yeah.
Snyder argues that when people start anticipating what a repressive government might want, they start making compromises and concessions before they're even asked to. It's like they're paving the way for tyranny themselves.
He uses the example of Austria's annexation by Nazi Germany.
Right.
And it's a chilling illustration.
Yeah.
Ordinary Austrians, not even Nazis, started participating in the persecution of Jews before any official orders were given.
Wow.
It's that chilling effect of anticipatory obedience
Right.
that really lets tyranny take hold.
And what's so crazy is Snyder ties this historical example to the Milgram experiment.
Oh, yeah?
The one where ordinary Americans were willing to inflict what they believed were potentially fatal electric shocks on another person just because a guy in a lab coat told them to.
Right. The Milgram experiment showed that this isn't just a German thing or an Austrian thing, it's a human thing.
It's a human thing.
Yeah, it reveals a disturbing tendency to obey authority even when it clashes with our own sense of morality.
It really makes you think.
Yeah.
How many of us would have the guts to say no in that situation?
Right.
It's easy to think we'd never do that, but history and these experiments suggest otherwise.
Exactly. And that's precisely why Snyder's second lesson is so crucial. Defend institutions.
Yes.
We can't just assume that things like the courts, the free press, our democratic systems will automatically protect themselves.
Yeah.
We have to actively participate in safeguarding them.
Right. Snyder uses the example of German Jews who, at first, didn't really see the Nazi Party as a major threat.
Right.
They figured, hey, we have strong institutions, surely they'll protect us.
Right.
And we know how that turned out.
Yeah, and that's why Snyder stresses the importance of vigilance and active participation. It's like a muscle. If you don't use it, you lose it. Democracy isn't a spectator sport. It requires us to be informed, engaged, and willing to speak up when things go wrong.
Which brings us to the third lesson. Beware the one-party state. I think we tend to take a multi-party system for granted, but Snyder points out how fragile that system really is.
Yes, he uses historical examples like Nazi Germany and Czechoslovakia to show how a single party can exploit democratic loopholes, gradually consolidate power, and eventually dismantle the very institutions that were meant to keep them in check.
Right.
Yeah, it's a chilling reminder of how easily things can unravel.
It really is. He even poses a pretty thought-provoking question to the reader, asking us to consider, have we become complacent about our right to vote? Do we even realize how easily it could be taken away? It's something I know I personally take for granted.
Absolutely. And as we go deeper into On Tyranny, you'll see how this theme of personal responsibility and recognizing those seemingly small signs of encroaching tyranny really becomes central to Snyder's message.
Speaking of signs, Snyder delves into how even seemingly harmless symbols and language can be weaponized. His fourth lesson, take responsibility for the face of the world, was a real eye-opener for me.
Yeah, this lesson is all about being aware of the subtle ways that visuals and words can be used to shift public perception and ultimately normalize, really harmful ideologies. He uses the example of Stalinist propaganda that portrayed prosperous farmers as pigs.
Oh, wow.
To dehumanize them, making it easier to justify their persecution.
Right, and this really resonated with me because it reminds me of all the online hate speech and misinformation we see today.
Oh, yeah.
People are constantly being labeled and categorized and dehumanized, and it's scary how quickly that can lead to real-world harm.
Exactly. And Snyder connects this historical example to something that happened in Nazi Germany, the marking of Jewish shops.
Right.
It might seem like a small thing, just some paint on a building, but it contributed to the normalization of exclusion and eventually violence against Jews.
It's like these small acts of hate, whether they are visual or verbal, are cracks in the foundation of a free society.
Yeah.
If we're not careful, they can widen and eventually bring the whole structure down.
And this connects to a more modern concern that Snyder explores in Lesson 9.
Okay.
Be kind to our language. He argues that the constant exposure to simplified, manipulative language online can erode our capacity for critical thinking.
Right.
It's like we're being bombarded with slogans and sound bites that are designed to trigger an emotional response rather than encourage thoughtful discussion.
It's true. We're so inundated with information these days.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the outrage and not take the time to really analyze what we're reading and sharing.
And that's exactly the kind of environment where tyranny can thrive. Snyder even links this back to On Tyranny by referencing Victor Klemperer's study of Nazi language.
Okay.
It shows how propaganda was deliberately crafted to eliminate opposition and mold public opinion.
It's like they were hacking people's minds with words.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what does this mean for us in the age of social media? I mean, are we all just doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past?
Not necessarily, but we have to be aware of these dangers and make a conscious effort to be more discerning about the information we consume and the language we use. You know, we need to be critical thinkers. Question the narratives presented to us, especially online. Seek out diverse perspectives.
It's about taking responsibility for our own online behavior, right?
Exactly.
We can't just blindly share things without thinking about the consequences.
Right.
Words have power, and we need to use them wisely.
Exactly. And remember, silence can be just as dangerous as spreading harmful rhetoric.
Ooh, that's good.
When we see injustice happening, you know, we have a responsibility to speak out. Even small acts of defiance can make a difference.
It's like that famous quote, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing."
Exactly. We can't be bystanders. We have to be active participants in safeguarding democracy, both online and offline.
This is already so much to think about, and we've only just scratched the surface.
There's so much more to unpack. Welcome back to our deep dive into On Tyranny. We've been unpacking how crucial it is to actively defend our institutions and to be wary of how seemingly innocuous symbols and language can be manipulated. Now, let's look at Snyder's lessons on professional responsibility and personal action.
Yeah, you know, we often think of tyranny as something imposed from the top down by powerful leaders or governments. But Snyder's fifth lesson, Remember Professional Ethics, really made me think about how everyday people in various professions have a role to play in either enabling or resisting tyranny.
He brings up this really sobering point about how professionals in Nazi Germany,
Yep.
you know, lawyers, doctors, even businessmen ended up contributing to the regime's atrocities.
Yeah.
They twisted legal principles, violated medical ethics, and basically turned a blind eye to all sorts of horrific things, all in the name of serving the state.
Yeah. It's a stark reminder that, you know, we all have a moral compass.
Mm.
We can't just blindly follow orders or look the other way when we see something wrong.
Yeah.
You know? Our ethical obligations become even more important when the people in charge are setting a bad example.
Exactly. We have to be willing to say no and stand up for what we believe in, even if it means, you know, jeopardizing our careers or putting ourselves at risk. And that courage to resist becomes even more critical when you consider Snyder's next lesson.
Okay.
Be wary of paramilitaries.
This one was a bit unsettling.
Yeah.
Snyder explains how armed groups that operate outside of the traditional military or police force can pose a real threat to democracy. He uses historical examples like the Nazi SA and SS, who used violence and intimidation to silence any opposition and create a climate of fear.
And he even draws parallels to the modern world,
Right.
expressing concern about the increasing privatization of violence with things like, you know, the use of mercenaries and private security forces becoming more common. It can blur the lines between legitimate state power and the use of force for, you know, purely political ends.
He really seems worried about these paramilitary groups potentially infiltrating or even taking over official law enforcement and the military, turning them into tools of repression rather than protectors of the people.
Right.
It makes you think about how easily power can be corrupted, even in societies that consider themselves democratic.
Yeah, that's why Snyder's lessons 7 and 8, be reflective if you must be armed and stand out, you know, feel so urgent. He directly addresses those in public service, particularly those who carry weapons. He's basically saying, hey, the atrocities of the past often involved ordinary soldiers and police officers following orders, even when those orders were morally wrong. You have to be prepared to say no.
You know, I think that's a powerful message, and it
Yeah.
applies to all of us, not just those in uniform.
Right.
We all have to be willing to stand out and resist the pressure to conform, especially when it comes to, matters of conscience.
He even tells this really inspiring story about a young woman named Teresa Prekharova. She risked her own life to help Jews escape the Warsaw Ghetto during the Nazi occupation. She's a perfect example of someone who stood out, refusing to go along with the crowd, and her actions saved lives.
Yeah. Stories like that are what make On Tyranny so compelling.
Yeah.
It's not just a dry history lesson. It's a call to action. It's a reminder that we all have the power to make a difference, even in the face of overwhelming darkness.
Absolutely. And speaking of taking action, Snyder then dives into the critical role of truth, connections, and preparation in resisting tyranny. It all starts with Lesson 10, Believe in Truth.
This lesson really hit home for me. Snyder argues that a blatant disregard for truth is like fertilizer for tyranny.
Yeah.
It lets it flourish. He lays out 4 ways truth gets undermined, and it was kind of creepy how he used examples from, recent events
Yeah.
to show how these tactics are still being used today.
Yeah, it's alarming how easily truth can be manipulated, especially in this age of, information overload. Snyder talks about the constant barrage of misinformation, the repetition of empty slogans, and the tendency to blindly follow charismatic leaders without questioning their motives or their claims.
It's like we're living in this hall of mirrors where it's hard to tell what's real and what's not.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what makes us vulnerable to manipulation.
Which is why Lesson 11, Investigate, is so important. We can't just passively accept whatever information is thrown at us.
Right.
We have to be active consumers of information, seek out reliable sources, and be willing to challenge those who are, spreading lies.
Snyder's really passionate about supporting investigative journalism. It's like he sees it as one of the main pillars of a free society.
Yes.
Because, helps expose corruption and hold those in power accountable.
He's also a big believer in the power of real-world connections, something I think a lot of us have lost sight of in the digital age.
Right.
He covers this in Lessons 12 and 13. Make eye contact and small talk, and practice corporeal politics.
These lessons were surprisingly insightful. It's easy to get caught up in the online world where we can connect with like-minded people from all over the globe. But Snyder reminds us that building relationships with people who are different from us in the real world is crucial for fostering trust and creating the foundation for, collective action.
He even suggests that something as simple as making eye contact and engaging in small talk can be acts of resistance.
Yeah.
In a society that's becoming increasingly isolated and atomized, it's about reminding ourselves that we are part of a community.
Right.
And we have a responsibility to each other.
It's like we need to break out of our echo chambers, both online and offline, and engage with the messy, complicated reality of living in a diverse society.
Exactly. And that brings us to Lesson 14, Establish a Private Life.
Okay.
Snyder argues that totalitarian regimes aim to erase the distinction between private and public life, making individuals vulnerable to manipulation and control.
He uses the example of email leaks and data breaches
Right.
to show how easily our privacy can be violated in the digital age and how that violation can be used to silence dissent and control people's behavior.
It's a reminder that we have a right to privacy and that protecting that right is essential for safeguarding our freedom.
Yeah, it's about being mindful of our digital footprint, being careful about what we share online and supporting organizations that are fighting to protect our privacy rights in this, increasingly intrusive technological landscape.
Snyder's not just warning us about the dangers of tyranny, he's also offering concrete advice on how we can resist it. He's giving us a toolkit for defending democracy in the 21st century.
And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore how he encourages us to look beyond resistance and actively work towards building a better, more resilient society.
We'll be right back with the final part of our deep dive into On Tyranny.
Welcome back to Bookkast, Bestsellers in Minutes. We are wrapping up our deep dive into Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny. So far, we've uncovered some pretty sobering truths, about the fragility of democracy.
Yeah.
And the ways tyranny can creep into our lives, often in ways that we don't even recognize. But Snyder doesn't leave us hanging with just a sense of doom and gloom.
No, he doesn't.
He actually offers some really practical advice on how to resist and how to build a better future.
Yes, and he emphasizes that resistance is not just about fighting back against something.
Right.
It's also about actively building something new.
Right.
Lessons 15 and 16, contribute to good causes and learn from peers in other countries, really highlight that proactive approach.
I was really struck by how Snyder frames supporting civil society, things like charities, nonprofit organizations, even just local community groups, as a form of resistance.
Right.
It's about creating those networks of support and trust that exist outside of government control.
Yeah, it's like building a safety net for democracy. A strong civil society makes it much harder for those in power to control every aspect of people's lives. It provides a space for dissent, for new ideas, for people to come together and organize independently.
And Snyder also makes a great point about the importance of learning from people in other countries. He talks about how some Eastern Europeans were able to recognize the warning signs of authoritarianism in the U.S. because they'd already lived through similar situations in their own countries. It's like they had a firsthand understanding of the playbook.
It highlights the value of broadening our perspectives and understanding that the challenges we face are not unique to us. By connecting with people in other parts of the world, we can learn from their experiences, share strategies, and build solidarity across borders.
Snyder even encourages us to get a passport, not necessarily to flee, but to experience different cultures and political systems firsthand.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's a reminder that we're all part of a global community, and we have a lot to learn from each other.
And as we become more globally aware, we also need to pay close attention to the language used by those in power. Lesson 17, Listen for Dangerous Words, warns us about how terms like extremism and terrorism can be weaponized to stifle dissent and justify, authoritarian measures.
Yeah, it's about recognizing those us versus them narratives that are so often used to demonize opponents and create a climate of fear. Once you start labeling everyone who disagrees with you as an extremist or a traitor, you're basically shutting down any possibility of meaningful dialogue or debate.
And when those in power start declaring states of emergency or suspending basic rights in the name of security, that's when we really need to be on high alert. Snyder calls this the oldest trick in the Hitlerian book.
Wow. He uses the example of the Reichstag fire, which Hitler used to justify seizing power and consolidating his control over Germany. It's a chilling reminder of how easily fear can be exploited to erode freedom.
Which brings us to lesson 18. Be calm when the unthinkable arrives.
Yes.
Authoritarians thrive on chaos and crisis. They want us to panic, to make rash decisions, to surrender our liberties in exchange for a false sense of security.
It's like that saying, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Exactly.
But Snyder's urging us to resist that urge to give in to fear.
Yeah.
He's saying stay calm, think critically, and don't let anyone manipulate you into giving away your rights.
It's about understanding that our greatest strength lies in our ability to remain level-headed, to think for ourselves, and to resist the temptation to trade freedom for security.
Yeah. I think On Tyranny is a really powerful book, not just because it warns us about the dangers of tyranny, but because it empowers us to do something about it. It's a call to action. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the future we want to see.
It's a toolkit for defending democracy and a reminder that we're not powerless in the face of authoritarianism. We have agency. We have choices to make, and our actions, no matter how small they may seem, can have a ripple effect.
So as we wrap up this episode of Bookkast Bestsellers in Minutes, I want to leave you with a question. If history doesn't repeat, but it instructs, what lesson from On Tyranny will you take with you? What will you do differently in your own life to protect and strengthen democracy?
Remember, the fight for freedom is a marathon, not a sprint. It requires constant vigilance, courage, and a willingness to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's hard.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into On Tyranny. We hope it's given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to take action. Until next time, keep reading and stay engaged.